you go over this? I said, sure. Of course, the campus ministries don't die off in 1970. They're still around in a variety of institutions, but this organization dies out. So we bring all that up to set the stage for the Crossroads movement, which is a precursor to the International Churches of Christ. Because one of the individuals influenced by campus evangelism and its strategies was a man named Chuck Lucas. Lucas led the campus ministry at the Crossroads Church of Christ in Gainesville, Florida. And the ministry was focused on the University of Florida there in Gainesville. And the ministry started in October of 1967, largely, very shortly after campus evangelism had started. Despite the influence of campus evangelism, which tended more toward this broad, denominational, ecumenical outlook on Christianity, Lucas was very sectarian and exclusivistic. So while on the one hand you have campus evangelism leaders attacking the idea of churches of Christ being the true church, Lucas is very firmly convinced that the churches of Christ, the Church of Christ is the true church, and that other denominations are false. So he has that mindset. Additionally, he's also concerned about the lack of evangelistic fervor among churches of Christ. Particularly, he believes that churches of Christ and Christians, Christianity in general, has abandoned the plan of Jesus for spreading the gospel message. Essentially, Lucas claims and believes that Jesus' plan was all disciples should be making disciples in one-on-one settings. All right, and so this emphasis on what gets called discipling. Now, what had happened within churches of Christ, according to Lucas, was people had turned to ministries, they had turned to paid staff, they had turned to a variety of programs to do their evangelism and their discipling for them. And so instead of doing it themselves, they were doing it, they had, well, we pay the preacher to do that, or we pay the youth minister or the campus minister to do that. Well, that lack of following what he thought to be the command and example of Jesus, this one-on-one discipling that everybody has to be involved in, was part of the reason the church was on decline. So, according to Lucas, we've kind of created these complex structures when Jesus' plan was very simple. And that essentially what was happening was Christians were trying to avoid discipling by creating these ministries. But discipling wasn't just about teaching someone and converting them. For Lucas, discipling was certainly, that was a part of it, bringing someone to the point where they decide to be a follower of Jesus, baptizing them, but then also there needed to be a continued involvement in the personal life of the person converted. And that the discipler was to, call the new disciple to total commitment. That's his language. Now, total commitment, part of that was that as a disciple, then you would go on and disciple someone else. But also was the idea of, essentially, once you discipled somebody, they became a convert, you were still involved in their lives, even to the point of monitoring their behavior and kind of expecting them, as you met with them frequently, that they would kind of report on their favor or even confess to you any sins that they had participated in. And so it wasn't just a evangelistic tool, it was also an accountability tool. And through this, the Crossroads Church of Christ grew. In 1970, there were 275 members. By 1977, the membership was over 1,000. And so within 7 years, it had grown 5 times. Most of the new members were students there at the University of Florida. As news reaches the broader movement of the Churches of Christ about what's going on at the Crossroads Church, there is a lot of interest because Churches of Christ had grown in the 50s and 60s, but there seemed to be kind of a tapering off of that growth in the 1970s. Yet here was a church that was growing and was growing phenomenal. So there was a lot of interest in, okay, what is Crossroads doing? Can we replicate that elsewhere? And so there's a lot of interest, a lot of positive things. But once people start really looking into what is being done, there is beginnings to be some concern that maybe what is being done is not an example of what Jesus would have done, but perhaps what's developing here is a cult. And so there was concerns that Lucas and others that were involved in this were actually using mind and behavior control like a lot of the other groups in the 1970s that were referred to as cults. And so that begins to be a concern. Well, Crossroads is kind of where a lot of this starts, but gradually the center shifts from Gainesville, Florida, to Lexington, Massachusetts. One of Lucas's students was a young man named Kit McKean. And so McKean had been converted through the Crossroads campus ministry, had gone through the process of discipling, and so he's kind of heavily imbibed a lot of what he's seen with Lucas. In 1975, he becomes campus minister for Northeastern Christian College in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which was a college within the Churches of Christ. So he's going to a Christian college, he's not going to a state school. But as he's interacting with the students at this Christian college, he becomes really troubled because he sees them as very lukewarm. They are not committed to their Christianity. In fact, he sees that many of them are just as immoral as students at state schools. There's not a morality there. And what he's really wanting to see is what he's imbibed in his youth, right, coming through Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, a lot of these people that were like no compromise, firm in their convictions. He wants to see that from Christians as well. And of course, shaped by Lucas, he has this notion of total commitment and some of those things related to that. But the fact that this is taking place at a Christian school suggests to him that this is just symptomatic of the larger Churches of Christ, that there is this spiritual malaise. The churches are are predominantly lukewarm. They are largely uncommitted, and he's very kind of dissatisfied with this. In the midst of all of this, in 1979, a small church in Lexington, Massachusetts, connects with McKean and wants him to come to Massachusetts to be their minister. About 50 members, right? So a lot of churches in the Northeast are not very large, even today. And that's true even in some of these other traditions. There's a lot of religious scripture are on the smaller side in the Northeast. So McKean says that he will come on one condition, that essentially he will come if the members would agree to become totally committed. Which, of course, it's unclear whether they totally understand what he means by totally committed, but, he wants to, you have to be committed to evangelism, discipling, those kind of things, or I'm not going to even bother coming. And they say, well, yes, we'll do that. And so over the next decade, the church, grew from 50 members to 3,200. which is a huge number in the Northeast for Churches of Christ. Eventually, they take the name the Boston Church of Christ. Sometimes they're having to rent out Boston Garden in order to have space large enough to meet. And so the group is sizably growing. And then it starts planting congregations in other places. By 1990, cities like Atlanta, Denver, Miami, and Orlando all had congregations with attendance over 1,000. Cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego are having attendances of over 2,000 people. By this time, 1990, Boston was about 6,500 in attendance. By 1999, Los Angeles had about 14,000 members. And so there's this huge growth that's taking place. And then, so you have places going throughout the United States, and then you also have mission work being done in London, the Philippines, Canada, Paris, Mexico, Hong Kong, elsewhere, Japan, all sorts of places. In 1992, Time Magazine features the group, calling it one of the world's fastest growing and most innovative bands of Bible thumpers, noting that worldwide there are 103 congregations, in the United States there are 103 congregations and 50,000 members. At the time, McKean still sees himself participating in the mainstream trajectory of the Churches of Christ. And what he sees himself doing is trying to revitalize what the Churches of Christ stood for, and those kind of things, and really trying to bring that back. But in the way he does it is actually moving the Boston movement away from certain things that were held as very important in Churches of Christ. So, for example, he's talking about the restoration of primitive Christianity. But for him, silence of the Scriptures was permissive, whereas for Churches of Christ, silence was prohibited. So if it didn't say do it, then you shouldn't do it. So the Boston Church of Christ gradually starts introducing instrumental music. Other groups connected with the Boston Church do as well. A second thing that's talked about as well is this notion of restoring the true church. But within the context of McKean's view, the Boston Church was the true church. So that anyone coming from even mainstream Churches of Christ were expected to be rebaptized to join a Boston church or the Atlanta church or San Diego church or something like that, believing that the mainstream church had essentially declined in its evangelistic activity, so converts in Churches of Christ had not truly been discipled, meaning they hadn't then also been baptized properly, according to McKean. There was also the emphasis on good works, often at the expense of talking about grace among Churches of Christ, and it's the Boston movement as well. But that further became, in the Boston movement, this notion of discipleship partners where there's this supervision, there's training, there's confessing of your sins, that notion of total commitment. There was also a different organizational type of structure developing in the Boston Church of Christ and its daughter churches. The mainstream group, of course, had continued to emphasize the importance of congregational autonomy, where each congregation was guided by qualified elders, but the Boston movement was starting to develop into this hierarchy with McKean at the top. And often the evangelists at local churches, these lead evangelists, were the ones who discipled the elders, instead of the elders being the leaders of the congregation. Furthermore, there were the continued accusations of cult-like behavior, and concerns that what was being seen was cultish, not replication of certain methods. Various college campuses across the nation began to refuse to allow members of the Boston movement to be on their campuses, which caused problems for mainstream churches of Christ. Because they're thinking, hey, we got to block the Boston Church of Christ, or we got to block the Atlanta Church of Christ. Well, here you have this other group, this other Church of Christ, that's wanting to have a campus ministry, and campus administrators aren't going to take the time to find out if it's the same group or not. And so it's like, we don't really want that here. We don't want that behavior here. So the Boston movement ends up giving the mainstream movement a bad name because of the cultist-like behavior.